In the winter of 1776, the world's most powerful empire believed the rebellion was dying. 13 colonies stood divided. An army of farmers faced the might of Britain. Freedom was only a whisper, fading in the cold. But from that darkness, something extraordinary began to rise. A new idea, that all men are created equal, that liberty is worth fighting for. This is the year that gave birth to a nation. This is the story of courage, sacrifice, and revolution. This is Liberty Rising, the story of 1776. In the year 1776, the world stood at the edge of a new age. Empires ruled the earth. Kings commanded continents, and the idea of freedom was still a fragile dream. Across the Atlantic, in the far-flung colonies of British America, that dream was stirring, quietly, dangerously, irreversibly. For more than a century and a half, Britain's American colonies had grown from small settlements along the Atlantic coast into thriving communities. 13 colonies, stretching from the rocky shores of New England to the rice fields of Georgia, their people were British by birth, yet in spirit they had become something different, independent, restless, proud. They built towns, farms, and families in a new land, and with each generation they came to see themselves not as subjects, but as Americans. They lived beneath the crown of King George III, a distant monarch who demanded loyalty, taxes, and obedience. For decades this uneasy balance held. But when Britain began tightening its grip, the colonies began to resist. It began with taxes, the Stamp Act, the Tea Act, the Townshend Duties, laws that touched every colonist, from the wealthiest merchant to the humblest farmer. The colonists argued that these taxes were unjust, imposed by a parliament in which they had no voice. Their rallying cry echoed across taverns and meeting halls. No taxation without representation. At first they petitioned, they protested, they wrote letters pleading for redress, not revolution. But each year the distance between crown and colony grew wider. British troops were sent to enforce order, and when order meant obedience, the seeds of rebellion began to sprout. In 1770, the streets of Boston ran with blood. British soldiers, surrounded by angry townspeople, opened fire. 5 colonists fell dead, among them Crispus Attucks, a black sailor whose name would echo through the coming revolution. The Boston Massacre became a symbol of tyranny, of sacrifice, and of what could no longer be tolerated. 3 years later, defiance turned to open resistance. When Parliament placed a tax on imported tea, colonists refused to submit. In the cold night of December 16, 1793, men disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded British ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbor. The Boston Tea Party, a daring act of protest that would provoke Britain's fury. In London, Parliament answered with punishment. The Coercive Acts, known in America as the Intolerable Acts. They closed Boston's port, dissolved Massachusetts' government, and placed the colony under military rule. To Britain, these were measures of discipline. To America, they were acts of oppression. In 1774, delegates from 12 colonies met in Philadelphia for the first time. It was called the First Continental Congress, a gathering of farmers, lawyers, merchants, and thinkers who came not as rebels, but as citizens seeking justice. There they pledged to stand together, to defend their rights as Englishmen. But history had already begun to move beyond negotiation. By April 1775, the fuse had burned to its end. British soldiers marched out of Boston toward Lexington and Concord, aiming to seize colonial weapons and arrest rebel leaders. But the countryside was watching. The alarm spread, from bell tower to farmhouse, from rider to rider. The British are coming! At dawn, British regulars faced a small band of colonial militiamen. No one knows who fired first. But when the smoke cleared, 8 Americans lay dead, and the revolution had begun. In a single morning, the relationship between colony and crown shattered. Farmers of Massachusetts had stood against an empire, and the world would never be the same. The next day, militiamen surrounded Boston. Within weeks, thousands of volunteers from across New England joined them. They called themselves the Continental Army, and they needed a leader. That leader would be George Washington, a tall Virginian planter, veteran of the French and Indian War, and a man known for his calm, commanding presence. When Washington rode into Cambridge in July 1775, he found not an army, but a collection of untrained farmers and laborers. Few had uniforms, many had no weapons. Yet from that chaos, Washington began to build the force that would fight for America's freedom. Across the colonies, war was spreading. In Virginia, Patrick Henry's voice thundered through the assembly hall, "Give me liberty or give me death!" In the north, skirmishes erupted from Ticonderoga to Charleston. And in Boston, the first great battle of the war, Bunker Hill, turned the city into a furnace of smoke and blood. Though the colonists lost the hill, they stood their ground against the best army in the world. The message was clear. This was no rebellion to be easily crushed. This was a people fighting for their destiny. Still, not all Americans were ready to abandon the king. Many hoped for reconciliation, a return to peace and normal life. In July 1795, Congress sent a final appeal to George III, the Olive Branch Petition, pleading for understanding. The king's reply came not in words of peace, but in proclamation. He declared the colonies to be in a state of rebellion, their leaders, traitors, to be hanged. There would be no turning back. As the winter of 1775 turned to 1776, the flames of revolution burned hotter. In the frozen camps outside Boston, soldiers huddled by dwindling fires. They were hungry, sick, and uncertain, yet they still believed. And beyond the battlefield, a new voice began to echo through the colonies, a voice that would turn rebellion into revolution. His name was Thomas Paine, a recent immigrant, a printer by trade and a man of restless conviction. In January 1776, Paine published a pamphlet called Common Sense. Its words were simple but explosive. "'Tis time to part." He argued that monarchy was tyranny, that America owed nothing to a distant king, and that independence was not only possible, it was necessary. Within months, Common Sense spread like wildfire. Read aloud in taverns, churches, and army camps, it reached hundreds of thousands, more than any publication in colonial history. It transformed the cause of resistance into a cause of freedom. No longer was this a fight for rights within the empire. It was a fight to create something entirely new, a nation built upon liberty itself. By the spring of 1776, the world was indeed on the edge of war, of transformation, of history itself. Empires watched nervously. Loyalists whispered of treason. Patriots dreamed of independence. And somewhere, beneath the snow and smoke of Boston, an army, untrained, unpaid, but unbroken, waited for its chance. The year 1776 would test the courage of every man and woman in America. It would see the birth of a declaration, the rise of an army, and the first flicker of a new nation's light. This is the story of how liberty rose from the ashes of empire. This is Liberty Rising, the story of 1776. Snow and desperation blanketed the American camp in late 1775. The men who had marched to the outskirts of Boston, hoping for a quick victory, now found themselves trapped in a brutal winter. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, frostbite claimed fingers and toes, and yet the dream of liberty, fragile and uncertain, refused to die. General George Washington, tall and resolute, walked among his ragged soldiers. He saw their suffering. He felt their despair. But he also saw something else, a spark of endurance, a quiet defiance that no winter could freeze. Across the frozen fields, the British Army watched from within the safety of Boston's defenses. Well-fed, well-armed, they mocked the idea that a band of colonials could stand against the crown. To them, this rebellion was already over, but Washington had other plans. The winter of 1775-1776 was not merely a season. It was a test of leadership, of conviction, and of whether the cause of liberty could survive its first true hardship. Supplies were scarce, morale was low, and Congress hesitated to act decisively. Many delegates still hoped for reconciliation with King George III. The word independence was whispered in taverns, but few dared speak it aloud in public. Washington knew, however, that time was running out. If this army fell apart before spring, there would be no revolution to save. In Cambridge, the commander-in-chief wrote letter after letter to the Continental Congress, pleading for powder, for uniforms, for structure, for recognition. He faced not just the enemy across the battlefield, but also the doubts of politicians who feared going too far. Yet even as frustration grew, Washington remained steadfast. He understood the power of example. His soldiers looked to him. If he faltered, so would they. Meanwhile, 300 miles to the north, a young man named Henry Knox was embarking on an impossible mission. Tasked with retrieving captured British cannons from Fort Ticonderoga, he braved frozen lakes and snow-choked mountains, hauling 60 tons of artillery through the wilderness on ox-drawn sleds. His determination was unmatched. A noble train of artillery, Washington would later call it. Knox's journey embodied the spirit of the Revolution, ordinary men doing the extraordinary for the sake of freedom. By February, as icy winds still swept the New England hills, the balance of power began to shift. The cannons arrived. The Americans, once armed with little more than hope, now possessed real firepower. Washington seized the moment. Under cover of darkness, his troops fortified Dorchester Heights, overlooking Boston. When dawn broke, British General William Howe awoke to find his position untenable. The colonials had done the unthinkable. They had cornered one of the most powerful armies on earth. Howe hesitated. To attack the heights would mean catastrophic losses. Instead, he chose retreat. In March 1776, British troops and loyalists evacuated Boston. For the first time, the people of the 13 colonies could claim a true victory. The city rang with church bells and cheers. Washington entered triumphantly, not as a conqueror, but as a servant of a greater cause. Yet beneath the celebration lay a sobering truth. The war was only beginning. Across the Atlantic, King George III received the news with fury. To him, the rebellion had gone too far. He prepared to unleash overwhelming force, fleets, mercenaries, and vengeance. Thousands of Hessian soldiers were hired to crush the uprising. Britain would not simply punish the colonies, it would make an example of them. Back in Philadelphia, the Continental Congress faced its own storm. The victory at Boston inspired some, but many still clung to the illusion of peace. Reconciliation was the word that filled the chamber. Independence, they said, was too radical, too dangerous. But others, men like John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and an emerging young Virginian named Thomas Jefferson, began to see that the old ties could never hold again. As the snows of March melted and spring breathed new life into the land, America stood at a crossroads. The British retreat from Boston had proven that freedom was not a fantasy, yet the question loomed, what now? Would the colonies declare themselves a nation, or retreat back into submission? Washington, ever cautious but clear-eyed, prepared for the next challenge. He knew the British would not stop. They would return, stronger, more ruthless, and determined to crush the dream before it grew too large to contain. He wrote to Congress, urging readiness for invasion, for discipline, for unity. He knew that the winter had only been the beginning. The struggle ahead would define generations. And as he gazed upon his army, a mix of farmers, blacksmiths, and boys barely old enough to shave, Washington understood the weight of what lay ahead. They were no longer just subjects of a king. They were soldiers of a cause. Their endurance through the winter of decision had proven one thing beyond doubt. America was not yet free, but it had found its will to fight. The winds of destiny were shifting. In the months to come, the cries for independence would grow louder. Pamphlets like Thomas Paine's Common Sense would ignite the colonies with words as powerful as muskets. And soon, from the ashes of endurance, the world would hear a declaration that would change history forever. The winter of decision was over. The revolution was about to begin. In early 1776, as the winter snows began to thaw, a quiet revolution was brewing not on the battlefield, but in the hearts and minds of the people. The victory at Boston had given the patriots hope, but hope alone could not forge a nation. The question of independence still lingered like a storm on the horizon, unspoken, unresolved, and filled with fear. Most colonists still saw themselves as loyal subjects of the British crown, wrong perhaps, but not yet ready to sever the bond of empire. And then, one voice changed everything. Thomas Paine was not a general, nor a statesman. He was a writer, an Englishman who had come to America only recently, searching for opportunity and purpose. But what he found was a people yearning for direction. In a modest Philadelphia print shop, in the dim light of a January morning, his words were set in motion, words that would set fire to the revolution. His pamphlet was titled Common Sense. It was only 46 pages long, but within it burned a message that would echo across centuries. Paine wrote not for kings or scholars, but for farmers, craftsmen, soldiers, for the common man. He spoke plainly, boldly, and without apology. These are the times that try men's souls, he wrote, and in doing so, he gave voice to what so many had felt but dared not say, that America must be free, that monarchy was tyranny, and that liberty was the right of all people, not the privilege of the few. His words were a thunderclap across the colonies. They stripped away illusion, tore down hesitation, and transformed rebellion into revolution. In taverns, meeting houses, and army camps, men read his words aloud by candlelight. They shouted, argued, and wept. For the first time, ordinary people began to see themselves not as colonists, but as Americans. The sun never shined on a cause of greater worth, Paine declared. And in that truth, something powerful awakened. The pamphlet spread like wildfire. Within months, over 500,000 copies circulated across the colonies, an astounding number for the time. It was read in New England villages and southern plantations, in urban streets and frontier cabins. Even George Washington himself, upon reading it, praised its impact, writing that it worked a powerful change in the minds of men. The tide of opinion was turning, yet not all were ready to embrace this new reality. In the halls of the Continental Congress, debate raged. John Dickinson of Pennsylvania urged caution, fearing that a declaration of independence would bring ruin. Others, like John Adams, saw hesitation as betrayal. "We are in the very midst of revolution," Adams argued. "Why then pretend to reconcile?" In the streets outside, the people were already ahead of their leaders. Flags were raised, royal symbols torn down, and toasts made to liberty. In New York, a mob toppled the statue of King George III, melting it down into musket balls for the Continental Army. The people were no longer waiting for permission to be free. Meanwhile, across the sea, King George III had made his position clear. In his speech before Parliament, he denounced the colonists as traitors. "The die is now cast," he declared. "The colonies must submit or triumph." His words left no room for peace. The empire would not bend. The colonies must either stand as a nation or fall as rebels. As spring turned to summer, the pressure mounted. British ships gathered along the American coast, their sails white against the horizon, a promise of the wrath to come. Washington, now stationed in New York, prepared his troops for invasion. He knew that the coming battle would be unlike any before. The fate of the Revolution itself would hang in the balance. Back in Philadelphia, in the stifling heat of June, the Continental Congress faced history's greatest question. Richard Henry Lee of Virginia rose and introduced a resolution that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. The room fell silent. The moment that had long been feared and long been awaited had arrived. Debate consumed the chamber for weeks. Delegates argued with passion, fear, and conviction. Could 13 diverse colonies truly stand together? Could they survive without Britain's protection? Could they defeat the greatest army in the world? Each man knew that to vote for independence was to risk everything: property, family, even life itself. Yet to remain silent was to betray the cause for which so many had already died. While Congress argued, a quiet Virginian with a pen prepared to make history. Thomas Jefferson, only 33 years old, was chosen to draft the document that would proclaim to the world what America stood for. In a rented room on Market Street, he wrote by candlelight, his quill scratching across parchment. His words were measured, deliberate, and profound. "We hold these truths to be self-evident," he began, "that all men are created equal." With those words, Jefferson captured not only the purpose of the Revolution, but the promise of humanity itself. Day after day he wrote and revised, seeking not merely to justify rebellion, but to define freedom. It was a declaration not of war, but of principle, that government exists only by the consent of the governed, and that when it becomes destructive of those ends, the people have the right to alter or abolish it. As June drew to a close, the draft was presented to Congress. They debated, edited, and refined it line by line. Some protested the language condemning slavery, a contradiction too great to confront in that moment. Others urged unity above all, and on July 5, 1776, the vote was cast. 12 colonies in favor, 1 abstaining. Independence had been declared. 2 days later, on July 4th, the document was formally approved and signed. In that instant, the colonies became a nation. No longer subjects, but citizens. No longer a rebellion, but a revolution. Church bells rang, crowds cheered, and in cities across the land, the Declaration was read aloud to a trembling, tearful people. They knew the cost that would come. They knew Britain would not yield, but for the first time, they could name what they fought for: liberty, equality, and a new birth of freedom. As Jefferson sealed his words in ink, as Adams and Franklin watched with solemn pride, they knew that this moment would outlive them all. Empires would rise and fall, but the idea born in that summer would endure. "The cause of America," Paine had written, "is in great measure the cause of all mankind." From that moment forward, there was no turning back. The colonies had thrown the gauntlet before the world's mightiest empire. The Declaration of Independence was both a promise and a challenge. A promise to build a nation of free men, and a challenge to live up to the ideals it proclaimed. The world was watching. The king was enraged. The British armies were coming. And as the ink dried on the parchment, the Revolution entered its most perilous hour. Common sense had sparked the flame. Now it would be tested in fire. The ink on the Declaration of Independence had barely dried when the world began to shift. It was July 1776, a summer heavy with heat, tension, and destiny. In Philadelphia, the bells had rung in celebration, their sound echoing through cobblestone streets as crowds gathered to hear the words that would change history. "We hold these truths to be self-evident." Those words were read aloud in town squares from New Hampshire to Georgia, and for a moment, hope drowned out fear. The people cheered, soldiers wept, and in that fleeting instant, the dream of liberty felt real. But the euphoria could not last. Freedom had been declared, but it was far from won. Across the sea, King George III received the news not as a declaration of ideals, but as an act of war. To him, these were not free men, they were traitors. The British Empire, vast and unyielding, would now bring its full force to bear upon the rebellion. The American colonies had dared to defy the crown. Now, the king would send an army to remind them of their place. In the harbors of New York, the horizon turned black with sails. Ship after ship arrived, stretching farther than the eye could see. It was the largest armada ever assembled by Britain, over 400 vessels, carrying 32,000 soldiers and sailors commanded by General William Howe and Admiral Richard Howe. Among them were Hessian mercenaries from Germany, known for their discipline and ferocity. The people of New York watched in silence as the sea itself seemed to turn into a floating fortress. General George Washington, now commander of the Continental Army, knew what was coming. His forces numbered barely half that of the enemy, poorly trained and poorly supplied. He had taken position on Manhattan and Long Island, determined to defend the new nation's freedom. But he also knew that this battle would test not only his army, but the very survival of the Revolution. In late August, the storm finally broke. The Battle of Long Island erupted in chaos and smoke. The British landed quietly under cover of fog, outflanking Washington's men. The redcoats advanced in perfect formation, bayonets glinting in the morning light. The Americans fought bravely but were overwhelmed. Confusion spread. Men fell. The dream of independence seemed to crumble beneath the weight of British steel. For the first time, Washington faced total annihilation. Yet, in the darkness of defeat, he found a way out. As night fell, he ordered a silent retreat. Boats ferried thousands of soldiers across the East River under a thick blanket of fog that rolled in just before dawn. The British awoke to find the American army gone, vanished as if by miracle. Washington's escape saved the revolution from collapse. But it came at a cost. New York would fall. The city, once filled with patriot fervor, became the stronghold of the British Empire in America. For the next 7 years, the Union Jack would fly over Manhattan. Fires ravaged the city, spies prowled its streets, and prisons filled with captured patriots who would never see freedom again. Still, the revolution endured. Washington retreated across New Jersey, his army weary and broken, pursued by the might of Britain. The world began to wonder if the experiment of liberty had already failed. And yet, even as the cause seemed lost, the Declaration burned in men's hearts. Its words were read aloud in every camp and outpost, reminding soldiers what they fought for. All men are created equal. Those words became a weapon of their own, a promise that could not be silenced by defeat. In Europe, the Declaration stirred whispers in royal courts. Kings and ministers read it with disbelief. A colony declaring itself free? It was unthinkable. But among philosophers and common people, it struck a different chord. It was a challenge to the old world, a spark that might yet light fires beyond the Atlantic. France, humiliated years earlier by Britain, watched with cautious interest. Perhaps, some thought, this rebellion could weaken their rival. Perhaps liberty could serve the cause of revenge. As the summer of 1776 gave way to autumn, the revolution teetered on the edge. Congress fled Philadelphia, fearing British advance. Supplies dwindled. Soldiers deserted. The dream of freedom seemed ready to collapse under its own weight. But in the face of despair, Washington refused to yield. He rode among his men, calm and steady, speaking of perseverance, of duty, of destiny. The harder the conflict, he said, the greater the triumph. On the night of December 25th, as snow and sleet lashed the Delaware River, Washington made his most daring move yet. He would strike back, suddenly, decisively, against the enemy's outposts in New Jersey. His troops, hungry and exhausted, wrapped their feet in rags, their muskets damp from the storm. Many could barely stand, but they pressed on, guided by faith in the cause of liberty. Through darkness and ice, they crossed the Delaware in silence. The frozen river groaned beneath them as they hauled cannon and boats through the storm. By dawn, they reached Trenton, a town garrisoned by Hessians, unsuspecting and unprepared. What followed would become legend. The patriots charged through the streets, muskets blazing, bayonets flashing. Within an hour, the Hessian commander lay dead and hundreds were captured. Not one American life was lost in the attack. It was a miracle of strategy and willpower. The victory at Trenton electrified the colonies. Hope, once dim, blazed again. Washington had turned despair into defiance. Days later at Princeton, he struck again, defeating British forces in open battle. The world began to take notice. The Declaration of Independence was no longer a piece of paper. It was alive, written not only in ink, but in courage and blood. As 1776 came to a close, the Revolution stood reborn. The British still held New York, their armies vast and disciplined, but the Americans had proven they would not be crushed. They had declared their freedom, and now they had earned the right to fight for it. Across the Atlantic, in the halls of Versailles, diplomats whispered of alliance. In taverns across Europe, talk of the American struggle stirred passions long suppressed. The idea that a people could govern themselves, that liberty could rise against empire, had ignited imaginations from London to Paris. The world was watching a new nation being born, and as the embers of that first revolutionary year faded, one truth stood clear. The Declaration had not only changed America, it had changed the world. The fight ahead would be long, brutal, and uncertain, but the torch had been lit, and its flame would not go out. The summer of 1776 had given birth to a nation of ideals, fragile, imperfect, but eternal. And from that moment forward, the war for independence was not just a struggle for land or power. It was a battle for the soul of humanity, the belief that all people everywhere deserve to be free. The Southern Gamble, 1778, 1781, the Southern colonies had long been seen by the British as the key to victory. Rich in resources, deeply loyalist in pockets, and vital for trade, the South promised a turning point in the war. In 1778, the British adopted a bold strategy, abandoned the northern campaigns that had stalled and strike deep into the southern states. They called it the Southern Strategy. By the late 1770s, the war had reached a stalemate in the North. The British believed the South, with its loyalist population, could be brought swiftly under control. Their gamble would reshape the war and the fate of a nation. British forces, under the command of General Henry Clinton and later Lord Cornwallis, landed in Georgia and captured Savannah in December 1778. The American resistance, led by General Benjamin Lincoln and local militias, struggled to hold ground. Yet, in towns and plantations, the struggle was not just military, it was a war of hearts and loyalties. Loyalists and patriots clashed not only on battlefields, but in their homes, on their farms, and in the streets. Civil war burned alongside revolution, and neighbors often became enemies. By 1780, the British momentum seemed unstoppable. Charleston fell in May, marking the largest American surrender of the war. American morale plummeted, yet out of despair arose new leaders and unconventional tactics. General Nathanael Greene, taking command of the Southern Continental Army, refused to fight the British head-on. Instead, he waged a war of attrition, striking quickly, retreating when necessary, and drawing the enemy deeper into hostile territory. Greene's strategy was not one of glory or decisive victories. It was patience, endurance, and cunning, using the vast southern landscape, local militias, and the determination of ordinary Americans to weaken the British Army. Meanwhile, partisan leaders like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, harassed British detachments with guerrilla tactics, disappearing into the marshes and forests after each raid. These shadowy campaigns frustrated the British, forcing them to divert resources and undermining their control over the countryside. Small bands of determined fighters, invisible in the wilderness, turned the British advance into a nightmare. In the swamps and backroads of the Carolinas, freedom was being defended in silence and shadows. As the British pushed northward from the Carolinas into Virginia, they met stiffening resistance and logistical nightmares. The Southern gamble, once thought a masterstroke, began to unravel. Cornwallis, moving his army into Yorktown, found himself increasingly isolated. The stage was set for a decisive confrontation, a convergence of American resilience, French support, and British overreach that would end the Southern campaign in dramatic fashion. By late 1781, the Southern campaign culminated in the siege of Yorktown. Surrounded by American and French forces, Cornwallis was forced to surrender, delivering a crushing blow to British hopes and signaling the beginning of the end of the Revolutionary War. The gamble had failed, yet in its failure the South proved the ingenuity, determination, and spirit of a new nation. Through adversity, Americans discovered that victory would not be given. It would be earned in strategy and courage and in unwavering resolve. The Treaty of Paris signed, September 3, 1783. A new nation born. The surrender at Yorktown in October 1781 had effectively ended major combat in the Revolutionary War, but the long path to peace stretched on. Diplomats, negotiators, and leaders now faced the daunting task of transforming battlefield victories into a recognized, independent nation. For years, representatives of the United States had been negotiating with the British in Europe, seeking terms that would secure not only sovereignty, but also a stable foundation for a fledgling republic. John Jay, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin, the American envoys in Paris, navigated a delicate balance of diplomacy. They leveraged British war weariness, French support, and global politics to craft a treaty favorable to the Americans, knowing that every word would define the future of their nation. On September 3, 1783, after months of negotiation, the Treaty of Paris was formally signed. Britain recognized the independence of the United States, renouncing any claim to the 13 colonies. Boundaries were established, stretching from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River, and from Canada in the north to Florida in the south. The treaty secured fishing rights, promised the restitution of property to loyalists, and set the stage for peaceful relations between the former enemies. The news of the treaty spread slowly across the continent. In Philadelphia, Congress received the word with solemn celebration. Citizens, soldiers, and leaders alike realized that the war that had consumed their lives, families, and communities for 8 long years had finally reached its formal conclusion. Independence was no longer an idea or declaration. It was a recognized reality. The signing of the Treaty of Paris marked more than the end of war. It heralded the birth of a new nation, fragile yet full of promise. The United States faced immense challenges, establishing a government, uniting diverse states, rebuilding an economy disrupted by conflict, and defining its place in a world of older, more powerful nations. Yet, the achievement of independence gave Americans a shared identity and the opportunity to build a country on principles of liberty and self-determination. As the former colonies began the work of nation-building, the Treaty of Paris stood as both a conclusion and a beginning. It was a testament to perseverance, strategy, and diplomacy, a reminder that freedom had been hard-won and must be carefully preserved. The Revolutionary War had ended, but the experiment of Republican governance had just begun, offering hope that the vision of a free and united America could endure. In the quiet streets, the bustling ports, and the open fields of the new nation, the echoes of victory lingered. Citizens looked toward the future, mindful of the sacrifices made and inspired by the realization that a dream, once thought impossible, had been achieved. The United States was born, not merely as a collection of colonies, but as a sovereign nation ready to chart its destiny on the world stage. The southern colonies had long been seen by the British as the key to victory. Rich in resources, deeply loyalist in pockets, and vital for trade, the South promised a turning point in the war. In 1778, the British adopted a bold strategy: abandon the northern campaigns that had stalled and strike deep into the southern states. They called it the Southern Strategy. By the late 1770s, the war had reached a stalemate in the north. The British believed the South, with its loyalist population, could be brought swiftly under control. Their gamble would reshape the war and the fate of a nation. British forces, under the command of General Henry Clinton and later Lord Cornwallis, landed in Georgia and captured Savannah in December 1778. The American resistance, led by General Benjamin Lincoln and local militias, struggled to hold ground. Yet, in towns and plantations, the struggle was not just military. It was a war of hearts and loyalties. Loyalists and patriots clashed not only on battlefields, but in their homes, on their farms, and in the streets. Civil war burned alongside revolution, and neighbors often became enemies. By 1780, the British momentum seemed unstoppable. Charleston fell in May, marking the largest American surrender of the war. American morale plummeted. Yet, out of despair arose new leaders and unconventional tactics. General Nathanael Greene, taking command of the Southern Continental Army, refused to fight the British head-on. Instead, he waged a war of attrition, striking quickly, retreating when necessary, and drawing the enemy deeper into hostile territory. Greene's strategy was not one of glory or decisive victories. It was patience, endurance, and cunning, using the vast southern landscape, local militias, and the determination of ordinary Americans to weaken the British Army. Meanwhile, partisan leaders like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, harassed British detachments with guerrilla tactics, disappearing into the marshes and forests after each raid. These shadowy campaigns frustrated the British, forcing them to divert resources and undermining their control over the countryside. Small bands of determined fighters, invisible in the wilderness, turned the British advance into a nightmare. In the swamps and backroads of the Carolinas, freedom was being defended in silence and shadows. As the British pushed northward from the Carolinas into Virginia, they met stiffening resistance and logistical nightmares. The Southern gamble, once thought a masterstroke, began to unravel. Cornwallis, moving his army into Yorktown, found himself increasingly isolated. The stage was set for a decisive confrontation, convergence of American resilience, French support, and British overreach that would end the Southern campaign in dramatic fashion. By late 1781, the Southern campaign culminated in the siege of Yorktown. Surrounded by American and French forces, Cornwallis was forced to surrender, delivering a crushing blow to British hopes and signaling the beginning of the end of the Revolutionary War. The gamble had failed, yet in its failure, the South proved the ingenuity, determination, and spirit of a new nation. Through adversity, Americans discovered that victory would not be given. It would be earned in strategy and courage and in unwavering resolve. The Treaty of Paris signed, September 3, 1783. A new nation born. The surrender at Yorktown in October 1781 had effectively ended major combat in the Revolutionary War, but the long path to peace stretched on. Diplomats, negotiators, and leaders now faced the daunting task of transforming battlefield victories into a recognized, independent nation. For years, representatives of the United States had been negotiating with the British in Europe, seeking terms that would secure not only sovereignty, but also a stable foundation for a fledgling republic. John Jay, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin, the American envoys in Paris, navigated a delicate balance of diplomacy. They leveraged British war weariness, French support, and global politics to craft a treaty favorable to the Americans, knowing that every word would define the future of their nation. On September 3, 1783, after months of negotiation, the Treaty of Paris was formally signed. Britain recognized the independence of the United States, renouncing any claim to the 13 colonies. Boundaries were established, stretching from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River, and from Canada in the north to Florida in the south. The treaty secured fishing rights, promised the restitution of property to loyalists, and set the stage for peaceful relations between the former enemies. The news of the treaty spread slowly across the continent. In Philadelphia, Congress received the word with solemn celebration. Citizens, soldiers, and leaders alike realized that the war that had consumed their lives, families, and communities for 8 long years had finally reached its formal conclusion. Independence was no longer an idea or a declaration. It was a recognized reality. The signing of the Treaty of Paris marked more than the end of war. It heralded the birth of a new nation, fragile yet full of promise. The United States faced immense challenges: establishing a government, uniting diverse states, rebuilding an economy disrupted by conflict, and defining its place in a world of older, more powerful nations. Yet, the achievement of independence gave Americans a shared identity and the opportunity to build a country on principles of liberty and self-determination. As the former colonies began the work of nation-building, the Treaty of Paris stood as both a conclusion and a beginning. It was a testament to perseverance, strategy, and diplomacy, a reminder that freedom had been hard-won and must be carefully preserved. The Revolutionary War had ended, but the experiment of Republican governance had just begun, offering hope that the vision of a free and united America could endure. In the quiet streets, the bustling ports, and the open fields of the new nation, the echoes of victory lingered. Citizens looked toward the future, mindful of the sacrifices made and inspired by the realization that a dream, once thought impossible, had been achieved. The United States was born, not merely as a collection of colonies, but as a sovereign nation, ready to chart its destiny on the world stage. On the night of December 25th, 1776, with winter at its harshest, General George Washington led a determined force of 2,400 men across the icy Delaware River. The soldiers faced bitter cold, snow-laden roads, and the ever-present threat of British and Hessian forces lying in wait. Morale had been low, enlistments were expiring, and the Continental Army teetered on the brink of collapse. Yet Washington's resolve was unshakable. He knew that bold action was the only chance to reignite the revolutionary cause. At dawn, the army descended upon Trenton, New Jersey. The Hessian garrison, confident and unsuspecting after the holiday celebrations, was caught completely off guard. The battle was brief but decisive. The Americans captured nearly the entire Hessian force, seizing arms, ammunition, and a much-needed morale boost. The victory at Trenton proved that the Continental Army could defeat a disciplined European force, and it electrified a weary public with hope. Buoyed by this success, Washington pressed the advantage. Just days later, he led his forces against a British detachment at Princeton. Once again, his strategy and timing delivered a resounding victory. The British, expecting the Americans to remain on the defensive through the harsh winter, were forced to retreat, and the revolution's momentum shifted. These twin victories changed the course of the war. The defeats of Trenton and Princeton inspired not only soldiers, but also ordinary citizens, reigniting belief that the fight for liberty was not lost. Enlistments were renewed, local militias rallied, and a sense of determination spread across the colonies. The turning of the tide at Trenton and Princeton demonstrated Washington's leadership, the resilience of his army, and the enduring spirit of the Revolution. From the icy banks of the Delaware to the fields of Princeton, Americans saw that victory was possible, and that freedom could still prevail against formidable odds. Voices of revolution. Beyond the battlefields, 1776 was also a revolution of ideas. The fight for independence was not only fought with muskets and cannons, but with pens, speeches, and moral arguments that challenged long-standing social norms. Abigail Adams, observing the formation of a new nation, urged her husband to remember the ladies, warning that liberty could not be fully realized while half the population remained unheard. Her words, though largely unheeded at the time, highlighted the growing awareness of women's roles and rights in a society grappling with the meaning of freedom. In the colonies, Phyllis Wheatley, an enslaved poet, celebrated the promise of liberty through her verse. Her writings gave voice to the contradictions of the age, a nation declaring freedom while millions remained in bondage. Wheatley's poetry reminded Americans that the Revolution's ideals were powerful, yet incomplete, and that the struggle for justice extended far beyond the battlefield. Native nations faced their own agonizing choices. The Iroquois Confederacy, once a unified force, became divided over whether to align with Britain, support the Revolution, or attempt neutrality. These divisions brought conflict to villages and families, illustrating that the American Revolution was not solely a war between colonists and the Crown, but a reshaping of the continent's social and political landscape. Enslaved Africans in Virginia and the Carolinas saw opportunity in the chaos of war. Many fled plantations, seeking freedom under the British banner, which promised liberty in exchange for loyalty. Their courage and struggle added another layer to the Revolution, revealing the profound tensions between the nation's ideals and its realities. The voices of 1776, women, enslaved Africans, native nations, and intellectuals expanded the meaning of revolution. They demonstrated that independence was more than a change of rulers. It was a profound reckoning with justice, liberty, and human dignity. The revolution's ideals inspired millions, yet its contradictions would echo for centuries, shaping the ongoing quest for equality in the United States. The struggle intensifies. Saratoga and the global stage. By 1777, the Revolutionary War had grown into a battle not just for territory, but for international recognition and support. British forces aimed to isolate New England, believing the rebellion could be crushed by dividing the colonies. Their plan depended on a northern campaign led by General John Burgoyne, advancing south from Canada toward Albany, New York. American forces, however, were prepared. Generals Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold marshaled militias and Continental troops to block the British advance. In a series of engagements culminating in the battles of Saratoga, the Americans outmaneuvered and surrounded Burgoyne's army. Facing starvation, exhaustion, and relentless pressure, the British surrendered in October 1777. The victory at Saratoga was more than a military triumph. It was a turning point that resonated across the globe. France, impressed by the American resolve and encouraged by the strategic opportunity to weaken Britain, formally recognized the United States and entered the war as an ally. Spain and the Dutch Republic soon followed, turning what had been a colonial rebellion into a global conflict. American confidence soared, and the revolution gained legitimacy in the eyes of both citizens and foreign powers. The victories at Saratoga demonstrated that the colonies could challenge Britain not only on their soil but on the international stage, shifting the war from a local rebellion to a cause with global stakes. Yet the struggle was far from over. Washington's army faced winter hardships at Valley Forge, where supply shortages, disease, and exposure tested every ounce of endurance. Amid the suffering, training and discipline improved under the guidance of Baron von Steuben, transforming the Continental Army into a more effective and cohesive force. The bitter winter forged a resilient army, ready to face the challenges of a prolonged war. Saratoga and the alliances it secured proved that the revolution's success depended not only on courage and strategy, but also on diplomacy, vision, and the ability to inspire allies. The American fight for independence was becoming a global enterprise, intertwining military action with political maneuvering and setting the stage for the conflicts and victories that would define the nation's future. The Southern Campaign and Yorktown. By 1778, the British shifted their focus to the southern colonies, believing that Loyalist support there could deliver a decisive blow. Georgia fell swiftly, followed by the capture of Charleston in 1780, the largest American surrender of the war. British forces appeared unstoppable, and the Revolution seemed on the brink of collapse in the South. Yet the American response was determined and cunning. General Nathaniel Greene, taking command of the Southern Continental Army, avoided direct confrontation with the superior British forces. Instead, he waged a war of attrition, striking swiftly, retreating when necessary, and drawing the enemy deeper into hostile territory. Every skirmish, every maneuver, weakened the British resolve and tested their supply lines. Partisan fighters like Francis Marion, the legendary Swamp Fox, harassed British detachments relentlessly. Utilizing the swamps, forests, and backroads of the Carolinas, Marion and other militia leaders executed guerrilla attacks that disrupted communication and forced the British to disperse their forces. What seemed like small, isolated actions collectively undermined the British campaign and breathed new life into the American cause. The Southern struggle reached its climax in Virginia, where Cornwallis, confident in his advance, pushed his army toward Yorktown. Washington, coordinating with French forces under General Rochambeau, seized the opportunity. Through careful planning, rapid movement, and the element of surprise, American and French troops encircled Cornwallis at Yorktown, cutting off escape and resupply. In October 1781, after weeks of siege and bombardment, Cornwallis surrendered. The British defeat at Yorktown was decisive, effectively ending major combat in the Revolutionary War. The Southern campaign had transformed British overconfidence into vulnerability, demonstrating that strategy, endurance, and unity could prevail against seemingly insurmountable odds. The victories of Greene, Marion, Washington, and countless other soldiers were more than military achievements. They symbolized the resilience, ingenuity, and unwavering spirit of a people fighting for self-determination. Yorktown marked not just a battlefield triumph, but the culmination of years of sacrifice, struggle, and strategic brilliance, setting the stage for peace and the birth of a nation. The Treaty of Paris and the birth of a nation. The surrender at Yorktown in October 1781 had ended major fighting, but the path to peace was still uncertain. Diplomats and leaders now faced the monumental task of transforming battlefield victories into a lasting, recognized independence. The war had been won on the fields of battle, but the struggle for legitimacy and stability would be fought at the negotiating table. American representatives John Jay, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin took their place in Paris, navigating the delicate balance of diplomacy. Britain, weary from years of war and strained by global conflicts, was ready to negotiate. The American envoys leveraged this, along with the support of France and the broader European context, to secure terms that would define the future of the nation. On September 3, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was formally signed. Britain recognized the independence of the United States, renouncing claims to the 13 colonies. Boundaries were established, stretching from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River, and from Canada in the north to Florida in the south. Provisions addressed fishing rights, the restoration of property to Loyalists, and the promise of peaceful relations between former enemies. News of the treaty spread slowly across the continent, reaching the halls of Congress, the streets of cities, and the farms of the countryside. Americans, soldiers, and civilians alike realized that the revolution had succeeded. Independence was no longer an aspiration. It was a recognized reality. The Treaty of Paris marked more than the conclusion of a war. It heralded the birth of a nation. The United States now faced the challenge of nation building, uniting 13 diverse states, establishing governance, rebuilding an economy ravaged by conflict, and asserting its place in a world dominated by older powers. Yet the achievement of independence gave Americans a shared identity, a foundation for the principles of liberty, self-determination, and justice. In towns, ports, and open fields, the echoes of victory lingered. Citizens reflected on the sacrifices made, the leaders who guided them, and the resilience of ordinary men and women. The Revolutionary War had ended, but the American experiment had just begun. From the signing of the Treaty of Paris emerged a nation, forged through courage, strategy, and unwavering conviction, ready to chart its destiny on the global stage. The legacy of 1776. The story of 1776 is not merely a chronicle of battles and declarations. It is the story of ordinary people who chose to become extraordinary. Farmers, writers, soldiers, and thinkers stepped forward, united not by blood or birth, but by belief. They believed that all men are created equal. They believed that government exists to serve, not to rule. They believed that freedom is worth any sacrifice. From the smoke-filled fields of Trenton to the ink-stained parchment of Philadelphia, the spirit of liberty rose. It endured the hardships of winter, the clash of armies, and the weight of uncertainty. It inspired courage, demanded sacrifice, and forged a new nation from conviction and determination. The Revolution of 1776 was more than a war. It was a promise that the ideals of liberty, equality, and self-determination could take root and flourish. From that year onward, the spirit of freedom has never fallen. It continues to inspire generations, a living testament to the courage of those who dared to envision a nation built on the principles of justice and human dignity. Conclusion. Liberty Rising. Liberty Rising is the story of a year that changed the world, when 13 colonies declared independence, when a general forged an army from hope, and when the promise of democracy first lit the American sky. 1776 was not the end, but the beginning, the rising of an idea that continues to inspire all who believe that freedom is the birthright of mankind. From the battles in the snow at Trenton and Princeton, to the debates in the halls of Philadelphia, to the voices of women, enslaved Africans, and native nations, the year revealed the enduring power of courage, conviction, and vision. The flame of liberty, once lit, would never be extinguished. It spread across continents, across generations, and across time, a living testament to the belief that a people united in purpose can forge a nation and inspire the world.